All right. Hello, welcome everybody to the early access panel discussion. Early access has been around for a few years. We had a panel similar to this at the previous Dev Days in 2014. We think it's worth doing this again because there's been so many products going through early access, a lot of new things being tried out, a lot of innovations, a lot of lessons learned. So I really wanted to get this panel together with these 5 gentlemen to talk about their different perspectives. A lot of them have different goals, different scales of their product. So it seems like a useful time to spend a little bit going over what kind of things they learned through the process and how that might apply to your products that you're working on for early access. So we'll get started by having everybody introduce themselves. I'm Alden Kroll. I work at Valve.
I'm Will Turnbull. I work at Klei Entertainment.
I'm Tyler Sigman. Red Hook Studios made Darkest Dungeon.
I'm Arthur Bruno. I work at Great Entertainment, made Grim Dawn.
I'm Russ Clarke. I work at Payload Studios in London. We make Terratech.
I am Tynan Sylvester. I work at Ludeon Studios and created RimWorld.
So we'll get the discussion started here by just kind of having you guys talk about a little bit about your early access experience and what you wished you knew going into early access.
I guess I'll start us off. So Klei was actually the first game into early access with Don't Starve in 2012. So we, at this point, have a fair amount of prior art in early access. So we, when it comes to doing Don't Starve Together or Invisible Ink, which are the 2 games we released last year, what we went through and did was kind of look at what we did with Don't Starve with 2- and 4-week updates and try to apply them in the games. And the big thing, especially when we look at Invisible Ink, that I wish I knew going into it was, can we take the model that worked for a game like Don't Starve and apply it to a new game? And we were semi-successful at that.
So we went early access in February of 2015, and it's kind of like our Kickstarter. We were fortunate to be able to look at a lot of games that had done early access before and kind of learn from that. So I feel like we were prepared for a lot of things, but one thing we weren't really prepared for is I really look at early access, it should be a fertile ground for iterating and trying out design ideas and changing the game until you kind of arrive at the mixture that you're happy with. And I think it can and should be, but I think we weren't really prepared for, we had assumed that pretty much everyone buying into early access is expecting that they're early adopters, that they understand that things are going to change, things are going to shift. And we sort of learned midway through our early access that we made some significant gameplay changes, and that became a huge community management challenge. So I think I wish we would have known maybe how much resistance there can be to changing what is already there versus just adding content.
We also went into early access relatively early on in the program and towards the end of 2012, and I feel like we prepared relatively well for it. I mean, I expected that a lot of people wouldn't treat it like an in-development game. They'd expect kind of a higher level of polish, and we did a bunch of testing, beforehand going into it to make sure that the sort of core gameplay loop was pretty tight and it was fun. And we had a good reaction when we launched, but the thing that I think was a little unexpected was once you release into EA, you're sort of stepping onto this treadmill where players have this expectation for continued content release. And being a small team, and having to build out content in a linear game with story elements and quests and all of that, it took a long time for us to release content, especially early on. I mean, sometimes it would be 3 to even 6 months before we'd have a release, and people would basically burn through the first 10 hours that we put out in a day and replay it a dozen times and then become very impatient for the next release. I feel like it was, in retrospect, I'm not sure that I would do anything differently in terms of when we released, because partially we did it for funding reasons. We wanted to be able to grow the team and increase the scope of the game and increase the rate of production, which we had done towards the end of early access. But if I could If I had more of a choice on what point we decided to go in, I think what I would do is kind of like preload development, where we went in with an initial release, but had sort of more content built out that we could release in more consistent increments.
So Will, that kind of matches your experience in early access, right? Where you guys try to get pretty far along in product development before you enter into early access.
Yeah, especially with Don't Starve Together and Invisible Ink, we try to get a nice full vertical slice of the game before we release. So we're about 75% done. And what we do is we typically do a paid beta before we hit early access. So we start to collect some metrics on retention, and we start to get some player feedback from paid customers, such that we can take it from halfway done to 75% done, and then release something that we're pretty confident is indicative of the final product at release.
Mm-hmm. So Teratech is almost the inverse of that in a way. We released into early access a year and a half ago, and it was very early. The product was a very, very different one from what it is now. Basically, because we had to, we needed the money. And so I can certainly relate to what Tyler was talking about, having negative feedback from significant balancing changes that we felt we needed to make during development was very much a recurring theme. But another thing that we weren't really prepared for that I would have appreciated knowing in advance was some of the deep-seated feelings in the player community about certain specific issues. For example, we launched with a DLC in the game, which is a little unusual for an indie early access game. Not a sort of content pack type DLC, but actually a kind of deeper early access mod with like a lab environment where you could test out stuff that was really experimental. Which we set a fairly high price point for, mainly to keep people out, because we didn't want everyone to get this thing. In fact, it's ended up having about a 30% attach rate, so we didn't quite succeed on that front. But, a success in other ways. But a lot of gamers, turns out, just don't like DLC, period. And especially if they see it in an early access game, they don't think it's indie, and they're not necessarily interested in listening to your explanation of why it's not the DLC that they think it is, or challenging their assumptions about why developers make DLC in the first place. So with a bit of preparation, if we'd known that in advance, we probably could have messaged things a little bit differently and smoothed that over a little better.
Okay. Well, that's like the dark side of the challenges that can come with dealing with having thousands of people in contact with a game that is changing all the time. But one of the things I've learned over time is just how much value can come out of a player base, especially when you get those enthusiasts who really get into it. I have people who, they want to translate the game into their language. They want to test it and give you bugs and help you out that way. And they can test more, unless you have some AAA-like testing budget, they can test more thoroughly than you possibly could in-house. I try to imagine doing the things that we were doing on RimWorld with just two of us working together with absolutely nobody else, and it sounds just impossible. Yeah. Because there's thousands and thousands of eyes and people who are committed and emotionally invested in the game, especially if they start building a community and talking to each other and comparing notes and creating mods. They will find issues that you would never have seen. They will create things and offer suggestions you never would have come up with. So there's definitely a danger in that emotional investment players have can go wrong if they're invested in something and they feel it's being taken away. But it can also drive serendipitous discoveries and drive them to create value that really helps you out and helps each other out in ways that can't really be predicted ahead of time.
So it sounds like you've been finding a lot of value in the feedback that you get from the community. Mm-hmm. How do you sift through that feedback to find what is the actionable chunks of feedback? Have you found a good process for that?
Definitely. It's sort of a mix of systematic and not systematic. Systematically, I try to, whenever a new worthwhile suggestion or concept comes up, I try to record it every single time. And I have this gigantic list of just random ideas and suggestions that I've had and our developers have had and friends have had and players have had. And the intent there is sometimes ideas don't sound good at the time, but later on reflection, they sort of bubble to the top. And I essentially just take that list and bubble sort the whole thing all the time and pull things off the top as tasks to accomplish. And how to absorb the feedback. That's the systematic side. Like that's how to do it in like a hard step-by-step method. The more impressionistic side is I love watching YouTube videos or Twitch streams or just people describing their gameplay experiences. And I try to watch large volumes of it, like tens of hours per month, ideally, or more. There's things that people don't report. And if you watch it enough, you watch enough different types of players, you watch the skilled players, you watch the beginner players, you watch people who are really creative, you watch people who want to consume content, you sort of develop this neurological, statistical model of what's wrong with the game, what's working right, and your brain will, I mean, people are very good at this naturally, but your brain will sort of automatically learn by sampling a wide range of data, what are the things that come up over and over, what are the things that just came up once and you don't actually have to worry about, and that saves you from focusing on something that is coming from just like one person who's close to you or someone who happens to be really loud. So consuming a large volume, and then there's just consume a lot of it and think about it, and it will things will pop out to you that come up over and over.
To support what Tynan was saying, I found that a certain like hardcore group of our testers during early access, especially some of the people who carried over from the Titan Quest forums, provided better testing and bug feedback than the professional testers that we had when we were working with THQ on Titan Quest. And also, like you were saying, I mean, you can listen to player feedback, read the forums, for months, and then as soon as you watch somebody live stream the game for the first time, you immediately see all of these things that jump out, and you're like, oh God, how did we miss that?
Like still, after all this time, I've watched, I don't know, hundreds of hours of RimWorld, and I watch it, and still it's like every 20 minutes I see something that's broken or sucks or I need to fix. So I'm still just like constantly taking notes.
Or the player does something that you would have never predicted.
Yeah, and the player would never think of it. They would never give the feedback. It's not a bug, or it doesn't seem like a bug. So just huge volumes of video test like content is just tremendously valuable.
I think it's a really good point that you get different types of feedback from different types of channel. There's the kind of feedback that you get from watching YouTube videos or from demoing your game live at shows where you can stand behind people. And then in the direct sort of written feedback channels, we have a forum, a private forum that we have on our own website. And the people who engage there tend to be very committed to the game. They're the ones who will write in a forum post like a multi-page essay on, where they think the game's going and why it's all wrong, how much they love it. And that is very useful in its own ways. But obviously, you've got to take what they say with a pinch of salt, or be careful about what you take from it. But then when you get feedback, for example, that you get in Steam reviews, some of which can also be quite lengthy, you almost have to judge them by weight. Like, we've got this many bad reviews that are about bugs, this many about performance, this many about difficulty curves, so maybe next milestone we'll spend this amount of time doing some optimization, to bring that down a little bit.
Yeah, I think you also have to really consider when you're reading the feedback, like what segment of the audience is this, and to what extent do they represent the overall audience? I mean, we listen to and get a lot of feedback on our forum. I mean, I think we have, I don't know, like around 15,000 subscribers in the forum. But you also have to consider that that's a very small portion of the audience, and I don't think it's a very good distribution, representation of the total audience, because I think just by nature of the fact that somebody took time to register on a game forum, they're already a hardcore player in a way. And that oftentimes there's this silent, vast majority of the audience that you as a designer have to try to consider, you're getting a lot of feedback from one segment of the audience, but you have to kind of try to evaluate for yourself, how is this going to impact this other portion of the audience that might even be much larger. And then on top of that, I think, especially when you're reading negative reviews, there's some of them you have to look at and say, okay, this is totally valid. We had certain goals that, where we should have met this player's expectations and we didn't, and we want to go back and try to address that. And then there are other cases where people aren't going to be happy with your game, and it's because, what you're trying to do is just not what they expect, and you're never going to please everybody. So I think, it's easy to get really bogged down under the weight of, because when you're flipping through your Steam reviews or your online reviews anywhere, as a developer, it's very easy to be like, okay, positive, scroll past those. I don't need to address those, and you don't read them, and you just focus in on all of the negative ones, and it can seem like there's much more of them than there really are.
Yeah, I think that's been definitely our biggest challenge as far as feedback during Early Access Darkest Dungeon is realizing how broad the player base is and what they expect out of the game. So, we sort of bill and advertise the game as a very difficult game, very unforgiving. And I think a lot of people would agree it's very difficult, but there's also a substantial amount of people out there that believe it's too easy once you figure it out. And, in the same day, you can end up getting just really intense feedback from, they're all part of your player base that I feel like, we owe. They purchased the game, and we would like them to continue having good experience. But in the same day for the same thing, you get people saying this is far too easy, this is far too hard, and you can't please everybody. And I think part of the something that's really helpful going into early access is making sure you know what kind of game you're making, which sounds obvious, but I think if you're saying, well, I kind of want to throw this up there and see how players respond to it, I think that's too vague. I think you need to think, this is what we're trying to do. Let's see if people like, or enough people like what we're trying to do. So, for example, in looking through, negative reviews or feedback, we do the same sort of thing, like look at all the sources and compile a lot into a document just to try to track. But one of the interesting things is I think it's okay to be able to look at a negative review, see what they are complaining about the game, and go, as designed. I mean, especially this happens on Darkest Dungeon, I think, because it's notorious for RNG and things like this, which, just to be fair, so is D&D. There's no, you roll the d20, it's uniformly distributed, but in a video game, I guess that's people get angry. But so sometimes if they're complaining about a feature or something that is integral to the Darkest Dungeon experience, we say, yeah, we never said this is a game for everybody, and this just validates that we're actually doing successfully what we're doing. Now, at the same time, there's a lot of negative reviews that point out things that we want to fix. But if you don't kind of have a destination in mind before you get there, you're going to get blown all over the seas.
Yeah, I do think that's really critical to decide what you are doing and what you aren't doing. And one of the things that you can learn from people who are complaining about something that you never intended to even do or support is maybe it's a signal you need to communicate what you are doing better. So I think it's really critical to set the expectations of what the game is supposed to be about at the start. Or before the player buys the game, obviously, so they don't end up expecting something that you're not even trying to do, because that's a recipe for anger and low reviews and just pissed off people in general. So, for example, in RimWorld, we have problems with some people. They complain because, like no matter how good I get at this game or how hard I try, I always end up losing people, and it's really frustrating. And I just have to try to reinforce on every channel that I can that, look, this is a story generation game. It's not a skill game where you can get perfect and perform perfect. It's supposed to be about drama. There's going to be sacrifices. And there's no way to remove that without destroying the heart of the game. Yeah, I mean, that's something. It's just communicate what you're making and what you're not making. And don't take the feedback that's trying to pull you off of your target.
Have any of you guys found feedback that ends up really influencing a really different direction than you were expecting?
Yeah, Invisible Ink was a really interesting case study for that for us, because Invisible Ink, when we launched it onto Steam, we saw that our day one, we track retention for all our games, and that's outside of the community feedback, retentions are probably our best source of how the game performs. Is it sticky on day one? Do people want to come back? Are you retaining people long enough for them to be around for your next update and see it? If they're not around for long enough, do you need to do bigger, noisier updates to bring those people back and jostle them back in the game? But with Invisible, what we saw off the bat was our retention was lower than we expected, especially our day one retention. We saw that people kept on playing, and we were wondering, hey, what's the reason for this? And the first thing we thought was, oh, maybe we need to go in and put a tutorial. People just aren't learning the core mechanics of the game, and are getting really frustrated because of the difficulty curve, which was designed to be really hard, and they're bouncing off it. So we went in and put a tutorial, and that bumped up the retention a little bit. And then as you move toward release, a lot of the focus is in the game where maybe this is too uncompromising, maybe this is too hard. And so we turned down the difficulty. We added things like being able to rewind and try again if you lost, and it wasn't quite as brutal. But at the end of the day, that might have been a bit of a red herring, where we compromised a little too much of the early vision of the game in trying to respond to numeric feedback that we were getting.
Tyler, you mentioned earlier that big disruptive changes during early access was kind of a surprising element for you during early access. Did you figure out a good way for kind of handling or messaging to customers when you need to make big disruptive changes?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think any time that you make a big change to just fundamentally how the game works, I think no matter how you message it, it's going to be a challenge. But you can certainly slant the playfield in your favor a little bit. And we didn't do that. Honestly, we didn't see it coming. We were really excited about pushing out this update called the Corpse and Hound. So midway through Darkest Dungeon, we did some changes to combat because we felt like the systems were more exploitable than we had intended, and some of the depth in terms of the positioning and some of the combat mechanics weren't really being played up as much. At the same time, the stress system wasn't being as limiting as we wanted it to be. So in Darkest Dungeon, your characters can get stressed out. If they hit 100 stress, then they become what we call afflicted, which means they get irrational or abusive or hopeless and paranoid, these sorts of fun things, and that leads to a lot of, I guess, the Darkest Dungeon experience. But some people had found they could just drive them to 100, and the afflictions weren't doing enough to really curb their play style. So anyway, we wanted to plug a couple of these holes, and so we did this with heart attacks, which we added to the game, where if you keep building stress after a certain point, then they'll just flat out die on you. And then also in combat, we made it so when you take down an enemy, they leave a corpse, and the corpse stays there for a little bit and keeps the enemy's positioning. And there's lots of game mechanical reasons why we did it. And we were super excited for this update. We pushed it out. I remember I wrote the longest patch notes that we had written yet, and it kind of snarky tone throughout in a joking manner. I was really excited about all the horrible things we were inflicting upon characters, because that was kind of the Darkest Dungeon thing and what had worked for us so far. But the bottom line is it changed how combat worked, and combat is a really core part of the game. And we had kind of a revolt on our hands. And the scary thing is we really didn't know how big of the community it was, but it was by far the biggest complaints we had had to date, and was threatening to just keep growing and growing and growing. And that took us by surprise. So I think in the future, I remember saying this to my partner Chris, the artist on the game, before we pushed this out. I'm like, we're in early access. If this isn't where we can experiment with game ideas, what's the point? It'll be fine. Anyway, so we pushed it out, and I thought, though people will grouse for a few days, and then they'll calm down. It never calmed down. It just kept growing, and we eventually did address it. But I think that the messaging we could have done, if you're going to fundamentally change something how the game works, I think you can talk about it beforehand. You can push it out to an opt-in beta branch, and try to get some, at the end of the day, the community is your best resource as well. And the champions of the game come from the community, not necessarily internally. And if you push it out to maybe a small representative opt-in section, and they buy into it, then they're going to end up being your messengers after that point. If they don't buy into it, well, that's great feedback, and maybe you are pushing something bad into the game. So I think we could have staged the implementation. We could have messaged it beforehand. And then I know Chris, the artist, feels that we didn't dress it up to the same level of polish that we had done other things. And we did that specifically because we were experimenting. But all those things together, just dropping it on people, surprised, maybe not fully implemented or balanced, and had no advocates in the community, that's a risk. I think content generally goes over fine, but what really got me is someone's bought the game, maybe 5 months previous, they played it, and they were literally having fun the day before and not having fun the day after, and that's what ultimately drove us to put options in to disable it, because once you've taken someone's money, I feel like you have a little bit more, it's a thornier ethical issue, even though there's all the early access disclaimers, but we just felt bad that people were not having fun, even though we ended up keeping the feature.
I think there's this really interesting designer skill that I've just started to realize exists, which is figuring out what changes will piss off existing players, and which won't. Because it's not just any change, and it's not just making the game harder, and it's not just taking something away necessarily, although that's kind of one of the things that will cause issues. You can make changes that make the game better for a new player and better in abstract and better seemingly in every designer way, but will still make people who are invested in the old way angry. And there's sort of like, it's hard to figure out what those changes will be. I found it is like taking something away, anything that makes it difficult in a way that triggers people's psychological switch that they feel it's not legitimate anymore. It's somehow like not what the game is supposed to be difficult about. Like for example, in RimWorld, the game can get as difficult as we want it to in terms of enemies attacking you, but when your characters are going crazy or breaking down or falling apart, people don't see that as like a legitimate thing necessarily. And so they get angry at that, even though the enemies are much more of a problem for them. So some of it is about just communicating and testing to find out what's going to cause the issue. But I think there is like a place of study here is to try to examine the psychology of why do people rebel against this change that in abstract and every other analysis and with new players seems to make the game better. That's something that we need to look into, I think.
Stacking things didn't really help either when I think of it. Like we grouped our updates. We generally have like maybe a 6-week update cycle and brand the significant updates and kind of do teaser images and all that. And so we were encouraged to throw many things in at one time to make a big, meaty update. But like on this one, we did corpses and we gave enemies armor and we just drove the difficulty everywhere up at the same time. And I think we could have also maybe dribbled some things out. And it wouldn't have been quite the shock of just jumping into an ice pool.
Yeah. Difficulty increases are definitely a spark point. Removing anything that you can do and difficulty increases those are the two things that seem dangerous to me.
I think one of the most dangerous things that you can do, which we have a lot of experience with, unfortunately, is changing things that will basically erase a time investment that a player made in the game.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we struggled with during development is we had these things called components that you could collect and combine together to create like a finished component. And they were add-ons for equipment. And when they completed, you used to get a randomized completion bonus. And some of the completion bonuses could be fairly powerful. And so really hardcore players would just grind and collect these things and try to accumulate a set of all of the perfect completion bonuses, which could take a huge amount of time. And but we ran into this problem when we started, implementing the crafting system and just generally in terms of inventory that we couldn't stack these things because the randomized completion bonuses were different. So we talked about it over and over again. Is there a way we can make these stack where people can still find them based on the randomized bonus? And there was not really any good way to do that wouldn't have been overly complicated in terms of the UI. And so we put up a poll to the community saying, hey, we really want to change these things. Here's the benefit. Here's what you're going to lose. And people actually voted marginally in favor of it. It was like, 55 to 45 or something like that. And even then, I decided that we just couldn't pull the trigger on it because I felt like it was such a substantial portion of people that had voted against it. And these are like people who are just threatening, if you do this, you're going to destroy my character and I'm going to quit the game and this and that. And we did eventually do it. And there was some strife. But I think one of the things that helped mitigate it is that throughout development, we really communicated with our audience and tried to, I think part of it is you need to set expectations with people and give them some visibility into what your struggle is, what you're trying to do. And we really spent a lot of time, especially early on, trying to educate, especially the people on our forums, what our total audience was and try to describe to them where they fit into that audience, because I think it's a common phenomenon for players or even game developers to look at you and your immediate 5 friends, and if you have a similar interest, then everybody must share that interest because that's 100% of the people you know. But oftentimes, of course, we befriend and interact with people who are similar to ourselves and share similar viewpoints. Especially with gaming, we tend to game with people who enjoy the same kind of things that we do. And so, part of it was trying to explain to people that, the forum, while a very important segment of the audience, is a limited segment of the audience that doesn't represent the whole. And I think it's true in terms of early access as a whole, the audience that you have at the beginning of early access, the early adopters, are not going to be the same kind of player necessarily that you have by the end of early access, or even especially by full release. I mean, as you know, we found for our game, and I think it varies depending on the type of game and the genre, but for us, the majority of players were not interested in playing an early access game, and I think those were in a way a sort of a different type of player. So you kind of have to anticipate that the initial core audience you get is you're getting sort of a limited viewpoint. And if you, I think, focus in on that feedback too much, you end up kind of in an echo chamber where you're specifically designing the game for this limited portion of what may eventually be your total audience. And I think if you do that too much, eventually you may do things that will alienate people who may try to come on later. And so this component issue was something that we eventually went back and had a lot of heart-to-heart talks with ourselves and finally decided, you know, we know that this is the right thing to do because it's a mess right now. Even the players who love these completion bonuses are struggling with the inventory management. And in some ways, it was also creating a significant balancing problem because the people who were playing for 1,000 hours and getting the perfect set of completion bonuses had much more powerful characters than the average player. So it even made difficulty balancing very difficult. So we spent a lot of time explaining why we were going to do that. We eventually made the change. A lot of people accepted it, and I think because we didn't just do it and put out a patch that changed everything, but that players saw that we had thought about it for a long time. We'd taken this poll, we'd still deliberated over it, and then we put out an explanation of why we finally did it. I think that most of them were much more accepting of it. By the end, even people who had been adamantly opposed initially, over time, because we allowed them the time to do it, they sort of wrapped their heads around it and started to see the benefit and accept that it could be better. And we did have some people who were like, oh, I'm deleting my characters now, because you've totally burnt me. And then like 2 weeks later, we look and they've logged more hours in the game. So
yeah, there's a psychological element. Oh, sorry, Russ.
I was going to say, I think that tension between the need to balance a game that is in ongoing development versus the risk of eradicating time investment is something that's really fundamental to early access and like one of the core problems. It's one that we have tripped over repeatedly because TerraTech is a very granular game. It's all about building blocks. And people make creations out of those building blocks, and they use those for a long time in a game that might run for a long time. And if we decide that this block really has got too many attachment points, we should remove those 2 attachment points, that's just going to break someone's creation completely, and thereby their whole game save, potentially. So those kind of changes are really, really difficult for us to make. And in fact, going back to what you were saying about taking things away, any change that we feel we need to make from a balancing standpoint that involves limiting a function that people have got used to, it's very painful, but we're constantly having to do it. And one of the things we've learned from it is that because we're always releasing new blocks, new building blocks for the game, one of the things we've learned is that when we're thinking about our initial balance, if there's anything where we're trying to decide, should we limit this or should we not? We want to see what people do with it first. Always limit it first, because it's much easier to make it easier later, give more later, than to take it away. And if you do have to take something away, which is unavoidable sometimes, do it as quickly as possible. Because if you wait 6 months before fixing that thing you knew you were going to have to get around to at some point, you're entering a world of pain.
So that's a good point. You guys have talked about different cadences of updating cycles, and I know you mentioned I know Klei has much more frequent. You mentioned like a 6-week turnaround. Do you guys find that it really varies from game to game? Have you tried different time lengths for how frequently you update?
So for Klei with Don't Starve in 2012, we basically said, hey, every 2 weeks we're going to have a small update, and every 4 weeks we're going to do a big update. And we actually put a countdown timer on the game. So whenever you came into the game, you would know, oh, I'm 5 days away from the next update. I'm 1 day away from the next update. And we definitely found that was a very successful tool for creating more content. And Don't Starve, through its early access period, made a lot of content that way. There's a part of me, because we fell into that framework for working on all our games, that always wonders, hey, can we pivot more towards a system where rather than doing lots of smaller updates, we hold all our content for 3 months and do a much bigger splash update. And actually, Don't Starve Together, which is now out of early access, but a game that we still continually add content to, we're trying that right now. So we have a beta branch where you get dumps every 3 weeks of new content. And then for most of the player base, 90% of them, they'll get big updates every 3 months. So we're just getting the first update there. But I'm really curious on our side to see, is this going to be a better methodology for a game that's under development and continue getting new content?
For us, it was a mix of wanting to make the bigger content updates a thing, just that was part of our marketing strategy. And then also logistics of a small team, which might be a little bit different. I'm curious, Chris is a dependency in the art, and I'm a dependency in the design. And so sometimes our updates just got moved around because something's happening in someone's life, and that necessitates. What I'm saying is if we had done like every 2 weeks we're going to push something, we would have had to break some of that or just have smaller updates or bigger updates. And there's also quite a bit of overhead involved with pushing an update out. There's always bugs. Even despite your best efforts. And then you've got to, generally it's the next week after an update, we always found, maybe because our updates were a little bigger, the next week would always be devoted to kind of upkeep for that update. So we felt there's a big difference between having, say, a 2-week cadence and a 4 or 6-week cadence, just a certain amount of recurring overhead. We just found it was nicer to do a bigger chunk. But I think the marketing definitely drove some of that stuff. But we would push like a balance update. We could just push whenever we want. We didn't feel constrained to doing it on a cadence. If we felt like something could be addressed and could be broken off from whatever bigger goal we were working on, we would just throw it out.
I tend to hate taking on unnecessary responsibility, so I'm always very hesitant to announce release dates or commit to like a certain cycle of updates. One of my designers actually, when he came on, said, "Hey, I really want to do a update every 2 weeks, a news update to the community." And I said, "Well, I don't know if you know what you're getting yourself into, because as soon as you announce to people that that's going to happen, like you have to do it." And we have, and I think it worked out really well. But at the same time, it also just sort of demonstrated that like if you're post the update 2 hours later than you usually do for whatever, because you had to take your car into the shop or whatever, people start freaking out, like what's going on? Are the Grim Dawn developers still working? And I think that and that's just a news update. I think if you commit yourself to like a development update, within a certain time frame, especially as a smaller team, if you don't really have the resources to ensure absolutely that can happen, I think you can set yourself up for some backlash. And then, I guess in some ways I feel like it's always better to like set expectation low and over-deliver. And each of those updates does require a certain amount of overhead. I think maybe, because for us, like whenever we're putting out a big update, like you said, you push out this big update, and then of course, there's, bugs are discovered and whatnot, and then you spend a bunch of time fixing it, and a lot of times engineers or, content people can't check stuff into the main branch because, we may have to do another hotfix. So there's always like some residual from that slows down development for, a few days or a week or, more if there's a significant bug. But I think probably what would be a good cadence is if you could put out a major release like every, it really depends on the game. If you have a game that has more linear content, then I think, it's tough because that type of content can be more time-consuming to build, but at the same time, I think because people burn through the existing content and want something new, there's more pressure to release that at tighter intervals. But at the same time, another thing that I think that we found is players don't, I think, seem to weight the releases as much relative to the size of them as maybe they should. Like I think people, are more excited about a big release, but they're not necessarily, the excitement doesn't correlate relative to the volume of work relative to just putting out kind of a small release that maybe adds a couple weapons or something. So I think a cadence where you maybe have more frequent smaller releases that just help kind of keep people excited, keep people checking for updates about the game, and then have larger, bigger releases at an interval that's more manageable relative to your development team?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common pattern when you look at games that have an ongoing development cycle. It certainly works for us. In the early days, and we've been in early access for a year and a half, and even before that, we had smaller scale, similar processes. We used to do things on a more ad hoc basis, things when they were ready and so on. And the problem we found with that is that it's very easy to get distracted, or things come up and you have to deal with them, and to lose track a bit of maintaining the regularity. And if you're working on some big thing for a couple of months, and for whatever reason you couldn't get a smaller update out, you might not really notice how big that gap has gone. And then you've got people suddenly saying the game's dead, developers don't care, and you've got to really quickly jump on that. So more recently, we've adopted a regular cycle. We work in 2-week sprints. Every third sprint is a milestone release, we call it, where we update the stable branch. The other 2, we're working on stuff for the next milestone, and we're updating that on the unstable branch, so that those people who are into it get like the work in progress and the sort of bleeding edge stuff. And then we're supporting, obviously, the people who want a more stable build and don't care about frequent updates with the higher quality 6-week releases. And as well as serving those 2 different types of people, we've just found that having that rhythm really helps our own development process. It lets us plan better and make sure that we're not sort of losing track of our targets.
I think that's maybe a difference in team size, because for me, it's like I'm with 2 people, and we just do feature updates, and they can take 3 or 4 weeks, or they can take 3 or 4 months. And it seems to work pretty well. The one thing I would say that you guys haven't already covered is that I think, at least in a situation like mine, it's really best never to promise a date at all, even like an hour before you think you're going to release it. My updates come out, it's just a complete surprise. And because I have repeatedly found things, I'm like, I think in my head, oh, we're going to release this tomorrow. And then it doesn't end up coming out for like 3 more weeks, because you find some stack of bugs that just reveal another set of bugs. And it's sort of a pro-con analysis, right? Like the upside of announcing your release dates beforehand is, in my opinion, relatively small, because the excitement happens at release or it happens beforehand. Either way, you're getting the same sort of hit of excitement. But the downside is you're really risking that anger that he talked about earlier when you do it. So, it's really enticing to sort of, you want to feel like you're more certain about what's going to happen. You want to have this validation. And I think there's this psychological effect for developers where they want this sort of self-soothing effect that comes from putting out a release date and being like, OK, everyone agrees, and I'm validated, and I feel certain. But it can go really wrong if you can't actually hit that. So I think it's better to resist that urge and just surprise people. And eventually players get used to it. After a couple of years, they figure it out. They're like, OK, well, awesome, new thing, and I can play it right now when I hear about it.
So you found with the unpredictable schedule that you don't end up with customers that are saying, oh, this game is dead, it's been 4 weeks since an update, or do you do something to let them know that
is something, it has never been a big issue for us. There are things you can do, like I've had periods where I put out like a daily 2-liner of what I did that day. And sometimes it's like, did tax paperwork, balanced this feature, added like a gun or something like that. And I just try to do it, and people sort of trust that you're not just disappearing. So you can reassure people that you're there. You can just go and put a blog post up that says like, we're working really hard, and I think it is possible to announce the features that are coming if they are so solid, already implemented, that you know that they're going to work, because they already do work. It's the dates that I think are more dangerous to announce. I have, on a couple occasions, announced, OK, we're doing XYZ feature, because I've already got it working. We've already got it pretty balanced. I know it's 99.9% chance it's not going to get cut or something like that, and it's just a matter of bug fixing, which can take a few weeks. So it is possible to mitigate that.
Maybe you hit on something, your Skinner boxing updates.
Exactly. Like I've gone 7 months or 1 month between updates.
I can see how that approach works with a small group, because you can be that flexible. Yeah. Once you've got more than 10 people, I think it's harder to keep everybody productive.
Totally. And all this
doing that way
should be contextualized in especially the size of your team and the kind of game you're making and all that. The big advantage of tiny groups is you're incredibly nimble. So I play that to the hilt.
I don't know. I mean, we're over 10 people, but we still operate a lot like you do. We put out surprise releases every once in a while. I mean, people know that they're coming, but they don't know when. And in a way, I think you do have a bit of the Skinner box effect. Like, I've noticed in some ways people get more excited because they're like, oh, is the release coming today? I think it's going to be this day. And then people will actually start a poll, like betting on what day the release is going to be.
Yeah. I've had people do like statistical analysis of like the time between was here and here, but it's trending up or down, and they're trying to like find the x-intercept where it's gonna come out.
For larger releases, we have tried to like announce them, because I think sometimes there is a value in the press of being able to like put out a press release in advance, because like I think it has more value to the press to write a story if they feel like they're getting the jump on it. Whereas if players have already been playing it for a couple days, by the time it trickles over to the press, I think it's not as exciting for them to put out a release. So for really big content releases, like when we're putting out like new acts, we'd try to schedule a release date, but I mean it would still be, we wouldn't announce anything until we were pretty close to release. And in fact, a lot of times we'd build in padding where we would say to ourselves, all right, well, we want to release this in December. It needs to be done by like the end of November, and then we'll just sit on it for a couple of days, well, a couple of weeks, to ensure that it's completely finished by the date we're trying to hit. And of course, it was never finished when we thought it would be, so we'd end up going 2 weeks over, but since we gave ourselves a 3 or 4 week buffer, it worked out. But the flip side to that is that I feel like, comes with more overhead. Like, now we're sitting on this release and people can't check stuff in for a number of days until it goes out. So there's pros and cons, and I think that a mixture of both can be effective. And I think which sort of way to lean in the spectrum depends on, to some degree, just your team size, how you like to work, but also probably what stage of development you're in. I mean, I think when you're in later development, it's much easier to put out frequent releases because they can be just smaller things like balancing changes. You're tending to make smaller feature increments in releases at that point. Early on, I mean, we ran into cases sometimes where we're working on a big feature or a major overhaul of a system, and we knew it was going to be messy when it went in, and that it was going to take like weeks of testing to smooth it back out into a releasable state. And I feel like if we were trying to hit a cadence that was, too frequent intervals at that point, it would be hard to ever fit that in, because one release would be over and we'd, check all the stuff in, and I don't think that, some of these major, overhauls that we could have smoothed them over by the time that we would have been expected to put out another release.
So I want to leave some time at the very end to have a few questions from you guys out there. If you're working on your games, there's a couple of microphones. There's one at the end of this aisle, and there's one at that end of that aisle. We're going to keep talking for a couple of minutes, but if you guys want to line up at those microphones, we'll take questions in just a minute. One of the last points I wanted to follow up on was, how do you know, like a couple of you guys are still in early access, a few of you have already released. How did you know that it was the right time to actually transition out of early access to released?
We had a pretty clear, well, for one, we've added the final boss like 3 days before we launched, so that we knew we were finally done. No, I mean, we had a completion in mind. It was pretty much sandbox mode during early access, and we had a pretty solid roadmap that we kept to. Obviously, some things ebbed and flowed, but the feature set, and also, honestly, a launch window, I think it's something you have to take into account in your business planning, is like when you're launching, and so we had identified when we wanted to launch. There was originally, I think we wanted to launch around Halloween of last year, and it just wasn't possible, so we had to kind of look ourselves in the eye and go, no, when's the next good window? We picked another window that we felt was good and looked at the calendar of other games coming out, other high-profile games, like what attention is press going to have to be split over. So we did target a window, but we also validated that by looking at our feature set that we wanted to achieve in 1.0. And in the end, we had to take a couple things off in order to make our date, and then we've added those via free updates afterwards. So I think it comes back to just defining your product again, and I'm sure some games might be a little more organically evolving during early access, but we sort of knew what we wanted to make even before we launched early access, and it didn't substantially change during early access. So it was kind of just a matter of working through those to-dos and eventually saying, yeah, we can get done by January 19th.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. For Klei games, when you look at just the whole process of early access, when we do our beta before we go into early access, that's really for fans of the game, trying to get a sense of how the game will perform, do our fans like it. When we go into early access, the product's pretty polished, and what we're looking for there is, hey, fans of the genre or fans of our past games, come on and play. And when we leave early access, what we're really looking at is, hey, this game is ready for anyone on Steam to play. And when we feel like we have the content to that level, we say, hey, we're ready, 1.0, come in, play. And for us, that's definitely not the end of working on the game. It's not the end of updates, but this experience is the experience we want people to have, and we think that it's ready for everyone on Steam.
I think for us working on a game with linear content, I mean, it was kind of clear that to some extent the game was done when we finished the final content. And because we had spent a lot of time early on iterating on and polishing sort of the core gameplay and the feel of the game, there wasn't as much of that left to do at the end. I mean, in a way, I think we really benefited from early access because, once the game was in front of players, we felt like it was really important to make sure that what they were playing was fun early on. So we kind of front-loaded some of our gameplay and balancing polish, and because people were actively playing the game and theory crafting it, we were just balancing all along. And so by the time that we got to the end, I think we felt pretty good about where the game was. And so it was just a matter of finishing off the last of the content. And then one of the things that we wanted to do is make sure that we released, right after releasing a big chunk of content, so that it wasn't like the game's done and we're just kind of sliding out of early access. We wanted to basically finish the game and have it launch with exciting new content that would bring old players back in and get new people excited to see something that wasn't there before.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's take a few questions from the audience, and we can go with you.
Hello. Regarding player agony and feature iteration, just to motivate, I took a year off from working on video games to work on enterprise software where your user has a $500 million contract riding on these features that you're iterating on, so their agony is really high when you screw things up. What saved our bacon over and over again was feature versioning. So if I was going to roll out a new feature, I would lock it to certain businesses or allow a business to have it in certain domains and not in other domains. And in your instance, your mount points on your components for users who are already using it in certain save games, you would not roll out the new feature that would break those, but people with new save games, you would get that. Have you guys considered doing feature versioning ever?
Yes, we do that. For some things, we have to be selective because it is quite a high overhead way to work.
I'm sorry, did you ever?
And it depends what type of thing. There's features and there's content, and some of the pieces of content are, just like a building block that's a certain way. So what we will do, for example, is we'll have an alternate version that is locked to a game that was started after a particular build version or a particular world seed version. We can do that, but it still, it doesn't take enough pain away that we don't worry about that anymore. You see what I mean?
There's another issue, too, with it, which is it kind of poisons your feedback, because if there's all these different features and everyone's got a different bit mask of what features they're playing with, you don't really know what people are talking about or what context is coming in when you hear something from a player. So I think it really complicates the design process, which is why, at least on my end, I resist very hard any sort of on-off switch for features or anything like that. So there's that, and there's also just the fact that I believe as designers we should be able to create a single game that works well for its purpose for a broad variety of players, and I think there's pretty much always a way to do that, and it's kind of a bit of a cop-out to ask people to sort of design their own game in some sense by turning things on and off or playing some old version that they had some weird preference for. I think it's a solution for if it's absolutely necessary in certain critical situations, but as something that you do regularly, I think there's a lot of downsides to keep in mind as well.
For us, it's mostly around not breaking mods for players. As we continue to build out the game, we had mods that stretch back for 2 or 3 years. So whenever we look at feature versioning, it's mostly in lots of our players play with modded servers, and we want to make sure they continue to play with them.
I think also, I mean, at least for the base game, you want to have some degree of like purity in terms of like everybody's having the same experience because, I mean, especially for a multiplayer game, but even for I think a lot of single-player games, people play competitively in a way. I mean, even if there's no other players they're being directly compared to. I mean, I think a lot of times the player goes into the game and they're sort of weighing themselves against what they think sort of the everyman is doing and feel validated based on like sort of achieving more than what kind of the average is. And I think if we don't know what the average is, if everybody's having an inconsistent experience, there's no way to really, you know, weigh what you or somebody else has accomplished in a game. And especially in a game like ours, I mean, there are instances where we've allowed things like we've changed items, and because it's not that much of a balancing issue, we allowed the old versions to, you know, remain unchanged in people's inventories. They just don't drop anymore. But more significant things like a character class, I mean, if a character class is overpowered and you nerf it, I mean, you can't let, you know, one group of players continue playing with the overpowered character class and then everybody else has the nerfed version.
Thank you. We're going to take a question from here.
So with games being more of released as services where people are constantly doing updates or additions to the game, do you feel that there are any significant differences between how we build games now in early access? Or maybe another way of asking this question is, for those who have gotten out of early access, do you operate any differently?
I would say games definitely have to some degree become more of a service. I mean, you know, 15, 20 years ago, you basically created one version, you released it in a box, and like that was that. And it's part of the reason that I think the whole marketing cycle of games has changed. I mean, sort of the old way of doing marketing is all based around a focused publisher release to retail, where those boxes could be on store shelves for a certain amount of time. The in-store advertising is only going to be there for a certain amount of time, and then once that's gone, basically sales start to drop off, and it's, you know, it's kind of done. When you're, you know, involved in online distribution, the game's kind of always there, and while the exposure to it may decline a bit over time, the game's always in existence. I don't think people necessarily rush to pick up a game as, you know, on day one, unless it's, you know, this really hyped, high-profile game. But I think because there's so many games coming out each year now, even just looking at like the ARPG space, I mean, it was quiet, you know, 5 years ago, but now there's a lot of different titles to compete with. But I think that sales-wise, you know, what works now is that somebody may choose, you know, to play ARPG A instead of, you know, your title for, you know, the first 6, 8, 12 months, whatever. But eventually they're going to start looking for something else. They may do a search for ARPGs, and now they've found your title. And so you want to keep your game alive with frequent updates, you know, even after launch, because, you know, word of mouth is a big factor. I mean, I think if people look at especially a multiplayer game and they see that the community is dead, they have a lot less interest in playing it. And also just because the press and the way that people hear about games is so fragmented now. I mean, it's not like you get on the cover of PC Gamer like you did in 1995 and you've got it made. Now every sort of small press exposure that you get is oftentimes just a little bump in your sales. And it takes a lot of them because you've got, you know, the press is divided between so many sites. You've got streamers, YouTubers. People are hearing about games from so many sources that I think it really makes sense to keep having basically events, you know, content release events where you can get coverage, even if it's small coverage, to keep people talking about your game, keep it coming up in, you know, sort of the, you know, exposure cycle on, you know, various websites and whatnot.
I think the difference is, especially if you're considering early access, yeah, you need to develop live ops skills, and that's very different, I think, from being a traditional PC developer. So if any of you have spent time doing mobile games, I mean, I think that's a great learning from a lot of the mobile free-to-play world. Is what goes into live ops. And so like in our case, for example, we were doing all of our community management split between people in the team that had other roles until kind of the corpse deal. And that was when we finally said, we need a full-time community manager. And really glad we did. We brought on John Levy, has been with us for a year. And so you got to get good at releases, outward-facing communication. And that can be hard if you're a small development-focused team, because the reality is, customers just kind of need to know you're alive and working. And a lot of things can be resolved. And that goes on past early access completion.
Early access changed how we made video games. Before early access, we were doing games like Mark the Ninja, which are 14-hour, play it once type of games. And doing Don't Starve led us into it's just continual development. So as long as consumers are interested in the game, we have people working on it. So we have more people working on Don't Starve together today than we did when it released in May, and more than started on the project 2 years ago.
I think we have time for one more quick question. If we don't get to your question, you could probably find these guys wandering around outside, and feel free to ask them questions at that point. We'll take one from you, sir.
Oh man, I hope it's a good question. What is the reasoning and justification behind the pricing between the early access and when you released the game? And how did you handle the feedback from the community based off of those? Were they upset when it was higher or lower?
We raised our price. So during early access, we were $19.99. And when we went full release, we raised to $24.99. And our primary motivation in doing that was that we wanted people who had bought during early access to feel like, they helped us, and we wanted them to feel like they were an early adopter and got a little bit of an early adopter price. And we've had actually no negative comments that I can think of. And so I was kind of pleased about that. And I think it's just a matter of finding, it's all about value, I think, and making sure that you're pricing your game at something that people feel, it sounds obvious, feel it's worth. But I think that's a hard question to answer. And even, we were nervous when we raised the price a little bit, but we looked at other games in the genre, and, we know that it takes some ridiculous number of hours to complete the game. And so there's lots of gameplay hours in there. So we thought, looking at other RPGs that were $40, $50, $60, that we could probably go up to $24.99, still be there. But and it gave us, a little bit of a warm fuzzy about how we treated the early access players as well.
Yeah, we came in at the same price point, just based on looking around at other indie games and seeing what people seem happy with. And we haven't, we certainly don't plan to lower it. We haven't talked about raising it, although we might. It's interesting that as the game has evolved dramatically since the original release, that people are now getting a much, much better deal for that $20 than they were before. I think the main thing we've tried to be wary of, to be honest, is really deep discounts. If you've got a game that's in live development for a long period of time, once you start setting the expectation that you're going to do 50%, 60%, 75%, it's very hard to come back from that in future. So we've tried to avoid doing that.
I think there's an opposite side to the argument that Tyler is making as well, though, which is he's saying that early players get less, and so the price goes up, and so they get more later on. But there's, in some terrible summary that I just did, but there's also a principle where the kind of players you get really early on are the kind of people who are really into your game, and so would theoretically be willing to pay more for it ultimately. And so it's hard to balance out these things. My strategy was just to say, okay, they basically equal out, and I just kept the price steady the entire time. But yeah, you got to pay attention like what you're offering, but also the kind of people you're getting and price discrimination over time. And sales can be a part of that as well in the long tail. So
I think what Tynan said was actually a lot of what was in my head. The people that you get early on are often the people who are the most interested in your game. And another dynamic to that is if you are coming off of a Kickstarter where you've had certain tiers that grant people earlier access to the game, and where those tiers were priced at higher price points. When we went to release on early access, we felt like we had to release at a higher price point to sort of preserve the value of what those people had paid during the Kickstarter, even though they got to play for like a few months before we did the public, release, the store release on early access. We still felt like it was a little too early to drop the price point too much. But at the same time, the further along you get, the more that you start to encounter a type of player that is interested in your game, but they're not, they don't value it as much as some of the people who were early adopters. And so, we felt this sort of conflicting pressure where early players felt like, we backed the game earlier, we should sort of, people shouldn't get a discount who are coming in later. But then on the other hand, we were just seeing, a lot of complaints like this game is, I want this game, but it's too expensive, it shouldn't be this high. And to some degree, that's going to depend on the genre that you're releasing in. People have just vastly different expectations for price point that oftentimes have no correlation to the amount of actual work that goes into the game. And I feel like, unfortunately, right now, ARPGs is one of those genres, especially where there's fairly good free-to-play options that are like legitimately free-to-play. It's very hard to justify too high of a price point. So we ended up doing a little bit of the reverse, but we lowered our price, pretty far out from launch, and then we just kept it at the same price after launch.
We have a bit of a different philosophy on pricing, where we tend to try to give our early access players pretty much the best price, and we discount not that much. And the philosophy there is we want people to wait because they think the game is still under development and they're not ready to hop in, not because if they wait a couple more weeks or a couple more months, they'll get a better deal or a way better deal, and they should have waited because of a price reason.
Actually, one extra thing I would add is that I think the vast majority of the people who came in earlier and paid the higher price, were perfectly happy with it because they were the people who were most interested in supporting the game. And in fact, many people have bought multiple copies of the game just as a way to because they'd gotten so many hours of enjoyment out of the game, they wanted to keep supporting development. So
right.
I think you have to treat the audiences a little bit differently. You're basically your loyal base that I think can be very important to you. And then customers who come later who basically just want to buy the game and they're not that invested in it.
Also,
I think we're out of time.
Oh, we're out of time, yeah.
I think we got to wrap this up. But thank you guys, and thank you.
Cool.